As much as we see today, religion has had a very great share in shaping our lives throughout the history. Even its socio-political involvement and relevance today exemplifies this notion to a very large extent. However, religion as a social institution does not, of course, function in isolation. The nature of its interactions and influences are, of course, very complex. For instance, if we were to skim through the social history of Indian subcontinent, one would realize how religion has a lineage of its own, especially under the British Empire. And the most interesting aspect of it could be observed in how the British Empire influenced religious communities and their practices, and they often co-opted and promoted them. This, interestingly, allows us to have a greater insight into the workings of the British East India Company, and on the other hand also suggests that partnerships, no matter in what forms, were essential to perpetuating power, especially in India. This at times also led to the curation of new norms and practices, at times within certain communities, at times outside certain communities. And one such demonstration could be seen in the propagation of military culture under the British Raj. However, the involvement of the factor of religion in the military history of the Indian subcontinent is still an evolving field, especially from the subaltern lens. And despite the authority of the British archives, indigenous genres of history do portray an alternative reflection of the workings of the British Raj. Furthering this question of the involvement of religion, religiosity, subsequent cultural practices, and their associations with the British authorities. In this episode of Haqq, we talk to Dr. Nile Green, Professor of South Asian and Islamic History at UCLA. In his book, Islam and the Army in Colonial India, he has put forth a miraculous account by exploring the cultural world of the Muslim soldiers of colonial India. Dr. Green has engaged with the subaltern history while considering deeply the disparate and conflicting British and Indian concepts of historical discourse, religion in military culture, and Islamic holy rapture and renunciation during a complex transitional period of 1850 to 1930. Drawing upon vernacular hagiographies and oral traditions about 4 Islamic mistakes in colonial India, which are also, of course, central to the book. Dr. Nile Green explores the multifaceted and malleable nature of quote-unquote barracks Islam. This interview explores and examines such provided stances in the book, along with other broader perspectives on the relation of religion and the British Indian Army.
Right. So before we dive into the perspectives of your book, amazingly curated book, I must say, we have a couple of biographical questions specifically for the sake of our audience. So I'll just dive through them first, and then we move on to the other perspectives of your book specifically. So Dr. Green, why don't you start with telling us a bit about yourself, your intellectual journey, people who might have influenced you, or books that might have influenced you?
So, I grew up in the British Midlands, where there was at large, and still is, a large South Asian population, a large South Asian Muslim population as well. And my journey towards South Asian history, I suppose, began there, sort of, kind of in Britain itself. And then more specifically, really, on my travels, when I was 17, I wanted to get out of that sort of industrial area and got on a train to Istanbul. Unfortunately, I'd already studied at high school some Ottoman history. So really traveling around Istanbul and Turkey as a 17-year-old sort of blew my mind, quite frankly. And then over the next few years, I traveled more through bits of the Middle East, back through Turkey and Eastern Turkey and through Egypt and Morocco. And then at the age of 20, I ended up in India, which had been my destination for a while, but, it was kind of a matter of saving up enough money for a flight. So when I actually got to India, because of my earlier travels in the Middle East, by that point, what captured my imagination, I guess, and in a way, I suppose, what seemed more culturally intelligible to me was places like Nizamuddin in Delhi, one of the first places I visited, the famous Dargah of the medieval Sufi Nizamuddin Awliya. So as I traveled around India that first time at the age of 20, and it was actually, even though I'd gone very much motivated towards sort of studying sort of Hindu traditions, it was actually the presence of Islam in South Asia that actually captured my imagination. And subsequently, as I went on with my other studies, I went on to study Persian and realized then that there's this huge corpus of Indo-Persian materials in India. So by the time I came to write my PhD, or research my PhD, by which time I'd spent a lot of time in Pakistan and Iran as well, I settled on a city, I guess, by some measure now, called Aurangabad. And Aurangabad was I suppose, the last capital founded by the Mughals, founded by and named after Aurangzeb. And so I was very fortunate in a way to have a Mughal imperial capital, so to speak, to myself, that really had never been studied, had been kind of overlooked. And because I'm a historian of Islam and Muslims, primarily, I'm a historian of religion, I settled on writing about the three shrines in Aurangabad, three Sufi shrines that had been founded during that brief period in which Aurangabad was the Mughal imperial capital. And subsequently, Aurangabad became the first capital of Hyderabad state before the capital shifted to Hyderabad. And then Aurangabad remained an important city within the Nizam state right until 1948. And that we'll move on to this, but that sort of paved the way for my own encounter with what I came to call Barracks Islam, because one of the other shrines that I was introduced to in Aurangabad was of one of these Indian soldiers, one of these sipahis or sepoys, as one came to say in English, that was in Aurangabad. So that's, I suppose, approximately how Aurangabad and South Asia and South Asian Muslim traditions entered my life.
Right, that sounds absolutely interesting to hear, which also gets me to realizing, because you've already told how you actually came about to do this project, the initial parts of it. So, can you tell us a little bit about the journey of your book, The Islam and the Army in Colonial India?
Yeah, well, it started, as I mentioned, during my PhD research when I was living in Aurangabad. And I don't actually have a degree in history. My degrees were in sort of Middle Eastern studies, what was then called Oriental studies, so in languages and religious studies. And much of my own, let's say, kind of research, my methods were really shaped by my own life history, the fact that I sort of stumbled into academia really through being primarily interested, particularly in the 1990s, I guess, in that sort of age when I guess the internet was around, but it wasn't part of my life. I would travel through the Middle East and then South Asia and maybe make one phone call home, perhaps per month. Phone calls were expensive, and the internet, I didn't use the internet at all in the 20th century, not till about the year 2000. I think I sent my first email. Probably from Aurangabad, having said that. And I was very interested in the study of local Islams as a sort of a body of anthropology and of ethnographic literature on the study of Islam in local context. And that was my real sort of, interest in South Asia, in studying shrine traditions, pilgrimage traditions, Sufi traditions that were very, or at least seemed to me, initially very localized. And when I'd happened upon Aurangabad, as I say, having sort of, kind of traveled by this point and spent a number of years permanently pretty much traveling through the Islamic world, I happened upon Aurangabad because at first I thought, okay, this is a small provincial part of, the Deccan, almost South India, kind of beginnings of South India, where I could find these very localized traditions. But what, in the course of my PhD research, living in Aurangabad and studying Urdu there with my Ustad, when actually very, I suppose, initially founded by Sufi migrants from Central Asia. One Shah Musaffir, the traveler king who had literally walked all the way from Bukhara, what's now Uzbekistan. So even though what I was founding, I guess I was finding local shrines that had emerged out of this very very kind of cosmopolitan imperial moment in Aurangabad. But nonetheless, my research interests and my methods were influenced as much by, as I say, by anthropology and ethnography as by history. And one of the other shrines that, I'd spend my evenings wandering around and looking at other places than those I was strictly speaking studying. One of the shrines I was taken to by a local Indian friend was the shrine of someone called Bande Mian. And Bande Mian shrine, of course, his name means, as Urdu or Hindi listeners will know, it means something like the dear by bridegroom, something like that. And it's kind of phrase that would perhaps be given to kind of naughty young boys, something like that, boisterous boys. And the shrine of Bande Mian was famous locally for curing possession. So lots of women, Muslim women, but also Hindu women and women from the tribal communities in the countryside around Aurangabad would come there seeking possession, and there'd be sort of these kind of musical cures. There's a sort of a feature of various dargahs, Sufi shrines around South Asia. But it was only by talking in the evenings with a really wonderful gentleman who became a friend of mine called Sarkar. And Sarkar spoke beautiful, I guess what would have been called once military Hindustani, kind of very clear, kind of Urdu inflected Hindi, because he'd actually worked in the Indian Army for many years. And he also spoke, kind of very clipped and proper, much more correct English than me, I'm sure. And we would have these wonderful conversations every evening. And it was only sort of just by chance, during one of those conversations we were talking one evening over our cups of chai, that he said, well, Bande Mian was also in the army. And I was, what? No, hang on, but he was a Sufi, wasn't he? He was a majzoub. He was one of these God intoxicated. Majzoub, the Arabic word that goes into Urdu, means someone who's drawn, who's attracted towards God so much that they become almost, to all intent visible purposes, they become crazy, they become insane, they become pagal,
right.
But they're not, they're God intoxicated, they're majzoubs. So he said to me, well, Bande Mian was in the army. And I said, no, I had no idea. And this opened up then, just over these cups of chai in the evening, these conversations about Bande Mian's military background. And then bit by bit, on subsequent trips to Aurangabad, I was introduced to another lineage of the family, of the Sajjad and Nasheen, not the heirs of Bande Mian, because he had no family and no children, but his brother had children, and the heirs of Bande Mian's brother and the other sort of claimants to the shrine had actually this Urdu biography, this Urdu hagiography of Bande Mian that was published in Hyderabad state in 1922. And he was getting hold of that written text from the year that Bande Mian died, so more or less in his lifetime, and the beginnings of his shrine, the foundation of his shrine after his death, that opened up, let's say, my historical as much as sort of anthropological eyes into this history. And then subsequent travels and trips back took me to the shrine in a very small town north of Hyderabad, in this case, a very small town called Kazipet, where there was the shrine of Afzal Shah Biabani, who was the pir, the padri, as one would say in Urdu, from the English, from the Portuguese, padre, the kind of the military chaplain of Bande Mian when he was a soldier. And in turn, then I was shown by the descendants of Bande Mian the Urdu hagiography that was written of Bande Mian. So with these two key sources, then I have these two Urdu hagiographies of the kind I'd already been studying for my PhD, my first book, albeit more in Persian, I guess, for that first book from the Mughal period. But these two hagiographies that are about these two Sufi peers, but crucially, and we'll talk more about this, the designation of these two figures, Bande Mian and Afzal Shah Biabani, as it were, the spiritual guides, but also protectors, miraculous protectors of the colonial soldiers, of the sepoys. Their designation in Urdu was Pir Padri, which of course is a compound word. Pir in Urdu, from the Persian, the pir, the spiritual elder, but Padri, as I already mentioned, from the English and the Portuguese, a padre, the term for a military chaplain. So it becomes then, this became the first clue then that there is this distinct Islam that I came to call Bharat Islam, that is an Islam formed by the by the in the anthropological sense, I guess, formed by the context and the military context of life in the colonial army, but in this case, actually in the Hyderabad contingent, which was part of Hyderabad state, which of course was one of the princely states, and therefore at a certain remove from colonial India and indeed from the colonial Indian army as such.
Right. That sounds like an entire, like, very interesting journey altogether. Also, in addition to this, I would really like to know, like, what were the methodological approaches that you specifically took during the course of this book?
Well, as the book itself took shape, I suppose the anthropological dimension had less of a hold. I decided that this was going to be sort of a history book and a work of history set in the 19th and in the early 20th century through till about 1930. So shaped by my sources and therefore by the lives of these pir padris, the religious preceptors of the Muslim soldiers of the Hyderabad contingent. So, and that took me actually through into another couple of figures as well, including someone called Tajuddin, Baba of Nagpur, another former soldier who became a Madzu, who lived in Nagpur. He was actually in the Madras army, in fact, and then a woman, in fact, called Baba Jan of Pune, who would actually then be the preceptor and indeed in some ways the entertainer as well. I'll come on to this role of barracks Islam as being about protection, but also about entertainment for the soldiers. And she died in 1931 in Pune. So that sort of gave me the historical confines of my book. So in terms of becoming a work of history then, on the one hand, I was sort of, in terms of historiographical terms, of course, I was drawn to quite, I suppose, obviously and inevitably, this is subaltern history, quite literally, and perhaps more subaltern history than most works of subaltern history, if only for the fact that these really are quite literally subalterns. These are, as it were, in the language of the time, these are the native officers, literally what a subaltern was within the army. So they are, in terms of what the subaltern studies was trying to do, trying to address the history of these figures who were caught between, let's say, indigenous society and the demands of colonization. And of course, the soldiers, Indian soldiers were absolutely that. They were on the one hand true to their own military traditions of their various community backgrounds, whether Sikh, Muslim or Hindu from various regions of the subcontinent. They were influential, relatively wealthy, relatively well paid and pensioned, influential figures in their own largely rural communities where they came from. They're respected figures in their communities. But of course, there were also kind of key figures in empire and colonization and conquest. Indian soldiers, of course, helped conquer much of India, particularly after 1857. The Nizam, of course, was given the honor or the dishonor, depending on your perspective. But for him, it was an honor, being called our most faithful ally. That was one of his official titles after helping the British in 1857. Indian soldiers, of course, helped in the wars in Afghanistan. They were very key in the conquest of Burma, in the Boxer Rebellion in China, in various parts of Africa and Iraq in World War I, and of course throughout Europe in World War I, where Indian soldiers were, military historians at least, which I'm not, say that the Indian soldiers in World War I were the biggest volunteer army in history. So Indian soldiers are caught between the different demands then of life, particularly before the rise of the independence movement and so on, as that catches on after World War I. So in that sense, I was drawn in writing this book by subaltern history. But what struck me in particular was that famous phrase of Gayatri Spivak, can the subaltern speak? And what I was really excited by with these Urdu sources that are written in a kind of, at least one of them, a very colloquial Urdu, with capturing the direct, informal, Dakhani Urdu speech of Banda Mia himself. This was, yes, absolutely the subaltern speak. This is quite literally the voice of a subaltern and various other subalterns, Indian sort of military officers and indeed plain sipahis, kind of rank and file soldiers. They can speak, they did speak, their sources are there. But I think a point I didn't make strong enough in the book, actually looking back, was that that subaltern history does have its sources, and it should have its sources. And subaltern history as a school should be doing a lot more than that famous methodological phrase of subaltern studies, reading colonial, which is to say reading English archival sources against the grain. One needn't do that because there are lots and lots of Indian language sources, of which, I'd been fortunate here in being shown a few introduced to a few of these hagiographies by their own Indian custodians in the shrines, the institutions of Indian historical memory that are not the National Archives in Delhi and the famous libraries of Calcutta or Bombay, etc. They're parts of Indians maintaining their own historical and community traditions in writing, in texts, which are, as I say, subaltern voices and subaltern written records. So that was my one, my historiographical sort of methodology within the book. But more in terms of what I was actually doing was, I suppose, drawing more of my background in religious studies and as a textual scholar, and working with actually the hagiographies, the Urdu materials themselves, and asking, well, what kind of vision, not just of, let's say, of military history, what happens in the army, or indeed not just a vision of the social history of Indian soldiers, or indeed, the life of the subaltern between, let's say, the Indian village life where they came from and the demands of the colonial officer class. Not just, as it were, then that's this kind of life, but actually seeing how these hagiographies gave us a sense of how history works all together. And I think for me, the most interesting thing about these texts and this class of writing altogether in Urdu, in whatever other Indian language it might be, let's say, is it gives us a sense of historical causation, historical agency, how history happens. And what's very key throughout these texts then is the role of the miracle, the karamat in Urdu and indeed in Persian and Arabic. The miracle that comes through the Pir Padris, comes through the friends of God, the awliya in Islamic tradition. And that is an intervention in historical process. So one of the things I did in the book with using in methodological terms was I would try to identify specific historical events, such as there's an uprising, a so-called mutiny at the barracks in Bolaram, just outside Hyderabad in 1855. And Afzal Shah Biyabani then is one of the figures whose hagiography I had, is a sort of a key figure in that. There are also a number of clear, specific historical incidents, which I could pin down clearly and specifically enough to have both the Urdu account, let's say the subaltern account, the hagiographical account, the memory as transmitted. And it's important to say that these hagiographies contain many voices. The nature of these hagiographies, and it's a genre that goes back through Persian and Arabic, that it's a specific element of these genres, that they're polyvocal. So these Urdu texts that actually have the voices of many different people. It's part of the genre that one would say, there was the Sheikh so-and-such, Sheikh Falan, did this one day, and here's in a sense the proof, here's the testament that so-and-such said. Except in these texts, it's that it'll be sort of dafadar, kind of officer so-and-such or sipahi so-and-such said. So there's lots of these voices then of various Indian soldiers and indeed the other devotees as well of the two sheikhs. And what what I was able to do then was by contrasting and setting aside these Urdu accounts of specific historical incidents with the accounts by British figures of the time, whether British officers or political officers, because this is Hyderabad state, not part of colonial India as such. And I was able to present the two sides, as it were, of the story that gave this different sense of historical process. One then, a British, very mechanistic, one might say Newtonian, one might say Protestant, whatever it might be, but certainly a notion of historical process where the miraculous, where divine intervention, where the providence or whatever has no place. This is entirely a mechanical, materialistic view of history. It's also the dominant view of history we have when writing South Asian history, whether English or Indian or not. But then when we read it through the tradition itself, through subalternized, and indeed through subaltern pens, we have this vision of history when the very events on the battlefield itself are instances and a clear evidence of divine intervention through the miraculous intercession of Banemia or Afzal Shah or other of these Pir Padres that are called into him to miraculously intervene and save people on the field of battle. So that whole sense of how history works, what are the shaping forces of history, to me was the most important aspect of trying to understand what subaltern history is. It's not just, as it were, kind of another version of Marxist history. It's not social history in a materialistic, post-Marxist 1950s, 60s, E.P. Thompson kind of way. It's a very different view of history that actually is not just about the low classes, but it's a very different vision of historical process. So it was through that methodology, I guess, through religious studies and textual studies method that I tried to read these texts and say, okay, this is a very different way of looking, not just about military history, because I'm not particularly interested in military history, but it's a different way of actually, kind of looking at how Indian history works, and therefore how we understand this type of history by looking at sources in local languages, and particularly sources like these ones I looked at that are published by, really local, small town publishers, often privately published. And I think a level of, more generally, I would say, a level of source material for South Asia historians that is still way, 30 years or more now, after 35 years, I guess, after the beginnings of subaltern studies, a sort of a huge corpus of materials in many languages, of course, South Asian languages, not just Urdu, that in the 19th century, with the rise of print, increasing literacy as well, that, become really abundant. And as I say, can open up experiential, the sense of the experience of history that we don't have to, as it were, kind of fix into a vision of history that is actually alien to its own participants.
Right. And while you were sort of pinning this entire course and sort of trying to join the dots all together, so were there any sort of limitations that you might have faced while accessing the archival material or something like that?
Oh, absolutely. I mean, there were plenty. I mean, not least linguistic, kind of, challenging, finding my way through, these Urdu sources, and particularly the sort of Deccani Urdu was I suppose the first challenge. And indeed, I mean, some of the plain orthographic matters, these are sort of, lithographs, so which is to say printed manuscripts to all intents and purposes that were, in small town publishers that are not very clear. Is this a spilled bit of ink or wax, or is this a dot? So there were those plain issues which face us all as scholars. And as the older I get, and as I become a teacher, graduate students of my own, I always try to be frank and honest about those basic challenges that we have to confront, but it shouldn't scare us away from trying to learn to work with these types of materials. The other was the difficulty of actually finding materials that didn't become part of the colonial archive. To the best of my knowledge, neither of the source books, the two main hagiographies I used, were actually found their way into an Indian library, let alone into let's say the British Library. The British Library, of course, from inheriting the India Office collections, has an incredible collection of Indian language texts that are woefully underused by scholars. And the reason it did was because of colonial copyright law, that just as in Britain, Indian publishers were expected and required by law to hand in at least one. Well, I think they had to hand in 3 copies, one of which will get sent to London, and the others I think will be in probably Delhi and Calcutta. But the texts I was looking at, because they're part of Hyderabad state, Hyderabad didn't fall under these colonial copyright laws. So these texts had never found their way elsewhere. So there's the difficulty of finding texts. But again, that was, in a way, for me at least, and if I can sort of encourage other and younger scholars to work along the same ways, that was something I'd learned to do, I guess, coming out, in a sense, out of our anthropology, was learning to not just say, okay, I'm going to work in the Delhi archives, the British Library, whatever. I'm going out into the communities I'm working with, to their, as it were, the community institutions of memory, these shrines and their families, and then seeing what private collections and, as it were, non-academic, as it were, and non-state institutional collections. And I think that's, and that's what sort of opened the doors, lots of cups of chai, which of course itself is an important thing. One's not just dealing with bureaucrats or librarians, one's dealing with, one's befriending, one's learning from people who are part of, the tradition and part of historical memory itself. So those were challenges, but there are also things that I learned an enormous amount from, rather than just, as I say, kind of sitting in libraries and working out a vision of history that, as many people have explained now in theoretical terms, the dangers of and the restrictions, the limitations of creating a vision of history through an archive that is already itself constituted through a process of colonization or whatever, Orientalism, whatever wants to frame. So going out, so to speak, into the field, working with communities, their institutions of memory, their own texts that have been preserved in private collections, opens up realms of possibility that are certainly more challenging, because you don't know if you're going to find anything as a PhD student, compared to if you go to National Archives in Delhi or the British Library, you're going to find something. But it may not be, kind of perhaps something as revealing or interesting, and indeed something, by definition, you're not going to find something that didn't find its way into those libraries, like these types of, small town texts. So those are my methodological challenges, but also the rewards that came, the things I learned from the challenges. Private publishing, therefore, with monies, quite conceivably monies that are collected either from pilgrims in general, from these soldiers, that pay for the publication of these texts, which give us the body of evidence that allows us, 100 years later, to write about them. So again, even the actual historical evidence is constituted through this process itself of Barracks Islam. And the last thing I'll say then about how I came to think about this Barracks Islam, as I say, in this creative tension of colonial life, of service in the Hyderabad contingent, which then does, from the early 20th century, in 1902, the Hyderabad contingent, which had been a specific army within Hyderabad, the Nizam state, does become absorbed into the Indian army, the colonial army at large. And one of the things I'm interested then in is this tension between the ways in which the colonial army both promoted this Barracks Islam, it's paying the soldiers, and very importantly, as a really crucial thing of Indian army life, right from the early raising of military bans by the East India Company, freedom of religion for Indian soldiers has been absolutely crucial. Now, how one wants to explain this, kind of is perhaps a matter of debate, but at the bottom line, I think it's a pragmatic decision. That one can't expect Indian soldiers to serve the East India Company or later the Raj if one's suppressing their own religiosity. And of course, as we know, one of the major readings of 1857 rebellion is precisely over this point. And indeed, there's been more recent scholarship on for example, on the Vellore rebellion, or the so-called Vellore mutiny of soldiers in 1806, and the recent book, well, not that recent, 2007, Men Without Hats, about published by James Hoover, is published by Manohar in Delhi, is again sort of looking at the the importance of the conflict between soldiers trying to uphold their customary religious rights and privileges, and certain elements of the army trying to suppress them. So we have on the one hand that this really kind of striking element that the Indian army has freedom of religion long before the British army. So in Britain, it's some way into the 19th century before Catholics or Baptists or Unitarians or other Christian minorities are allowed to serve in the army. In India, you can serve in the Indian army, as I said, the East India Company's on the Raj army, whether you're a Hindu, a Muslim, a Sikh, or a Catholic, or whatever else. So this kind of, as it were, this freedom of religion is perhaps pragmatically necessarily built into Indian military life long before. And yet, as the 19th century goes on, there are two developments. One, of course, is the expectation that Indian soldiers will uphold a certain amount of the prestige of the company or the prestige of the Raj. They have to behave in certain ways. Now, on the one hand, those ways of behavior, of course, are military drill. new methods of drill, which help at least if you're not reading the hagiographies, it's the military drill. If you're reading kind of standard military history, whether written in 1900 or in 2021, it's methods of military drill which helped the East India Company on the battlefield in the 18th century. But there's also kind of methods of decorum, of course, of uniform and all these kind of ways of dressing and behavior that the British officers of the company or the Raj want Indian soldiers to follow. And then this creates a tension then during the festivals, and not least during these festivals, which are naturally religious festivals. Indian holidays, like traditional English holidays, were holy days. And among those was Muharram. Now, Muharram, one might say that's a Shia Muslim festival, but throughout much of South Asian history, this was a popular carnival, I suppose is the easiest way to say it in English, that has its Muslim origins, but people of all religions, particularly the lower classes, the subaltern classes, let's say, participate. And it's a carnival that in a sense is a free-for-all. People are drinking toddy, people are drinking bhang. There's all sorts of mummers, let's say, mockery kind of statues that still feature some parts of Muharram festivals in South Asia to this day that are mocking all sorts of Indian figures of Indian society, including the mullahs, the very kind of key figure of the mockery of the mummers, of the kind of sort of statues that are carried around, but also, of course, sometimes British Indian Army officers as well. So all of this kind of behavior that seems to be lacking decorum is one of the issues that, although the Indian colonial army is necessarily, in terms of its rules as well as its pragmatics, is upholding, indeed patronizing through its salaries and through the rituals and the ceremonies of different regiments that uphold the distinctive traditions of their own religious communities, particularly after 1857, when indeed, I mean, I think even either side of 1857 for that matter. But on the other hand, there's this sense of, well, some types of religiosity isn't real religion. This is undignified. These soldiers are meant to be upholding, wearing their uniforms or even behaving properly off duty, not getting so raucous and, kind of drugged or indeed drunk. And of course, this is also a problem, it has to be said, for the lower classes of the Indian army who are British as well. There's all kinds of disciplinary action that is held up against kind of the lower class British soldiers as well, particularly for drunkenness, for misbehavior, etc., etc. So one has then this tension that happens. And then the last thing I'll say is this tension then between the role of the army in promoting, but also trying to reform the religiosity of its soldiers, both Indian and British, has to be said, of its lower class soldiers. And Irish, I should very much add. There's a very large number of Irish soldiers in the armies of the East India Company, especially the Raj. Is that after 1813, in the renewal of the East India Company's charter, one had for the first time that missionaries were allowed into India. And the East India Company army, and the army in general, is really keen to keep the Christian missionaries out of the army because I think they're just going to cause trouble. And effectively, that's absolutely what they do. So these Christian missionaries, Protestant missionaries, of this new evangelical awakening that's been spreading in Britain. And of course, this evangelical awakening is partly concerned with, which sees the East India Company as immoral. This is a really kind of a moral and political critique of what we would now perhaps call liberals or leftists in British society, in British Parliament. They're saying the East India Company is just trying to loot and rape and pillage India just for money, but it's completely amoral, as it will be seen in those terms of the period of terms of morality, rather than as it were, obviously a Marxist or class-based terminology. So the evangelicals forced the East India Company to allow Christian, Protestant, evangelical missionaries into India. But the company doesn't want them in trying to preach to soldiers. But some of these chaplains, some of these missionaries get jobs as military chaplains, officially only as chaplains then to the British and Irish soldiers. But some of them then start to preach either directly, secretly, against the colonial rules and regulations, preach to Indian soldiers. Some of them manage to convert British officers themselves, and those values then in turn not necessarily trying to convert Indian soldiers to Christianity, but at least have a certain, let's say, what I call, and other scholars have called, a Protestant version of Islam, a notion that, well, if these soldiers under my command, so and such British officer is saying are Muslims, then Islam is about the Quran, is about scripture, it's about rules and regulations, about proper behavior. It's not about carnivals and drinking bang lassis and et cetera, et cetera. So I look at a few examples of some of these military chaplains and evangelical officers, and show how they start to, for their parts, try to promote a Protestant vision of religiosity that may not necessarily be trying to convert the soldiers to Christianity, but nonetheless has this Protestant, this more, proper, as will be seen in those terms, version of Islam that actually kind of coincides with the vision of many Muslim reformists in the 20th century as well, who are equally, if not more critical. In fact, or ultimately, I would say more critical of this miraculous and shrine-based religiosity than the army, the colonial army itself, as I say, which ultimately funds. This is this paradox that I'm exploring in the book, that the army ultimately promotes, funds, circulates, pays for this barracks Islam, while at the same time, a number of members of the military, influential officers, are critiquing it and indeed are trying to reform it away from this religion of the carnivalesque, as I think I describe it at one point in the book, which is a crucial part, then, as I said, of what soldiers want from their religion. They want a form of religiosity that gives them these days of carnival, their R&R, as well as their miraculous protection.
Right. So as far as I have understood it, the entire course of the picture that you've very intricately painted right here, Barrack Islam, if we look at it as a sphere in itself, as a public sphere in itself, if I were to term it, and in accordance with that, or in relationship with that, while we look at the larger picture or the other happenings or the events that were taking place back then in the colonial India, on the other hand, there was also this idea that, the compatibility of Islam with the aims of the colonial army, right? So do you think that in any way, this idea of incompatibility of Islam with the aims of the colonial army in any way might have also contributed to the larger, maybe polarized view being created by the colonizers at that point in time?
Let's see. Well, I think, I can certainly see that, particularly among the concerns of this, what was called, and there's a sort of recent scholarly literature on it, isn't it? The so-called Wahhabi conspiracies, particularly of the 1850s and 60s, part of which were actually seen to be centered in Hyderabad, that gave rise to a whole series of trials. And of course, there's one of the major readings of 1857, the Great Rebellion of 1857, was that this was, as it were, somehow an inbuilt dimension of the Muslims were always going to rebel. And of course, this is one side of British responses and reports and explanations and attempts to form post-1857, 1858 policy. And of course, of the disbanding, ultimately, of Bahadur Shah Zafar, the dethroning and the ending of the Mughal Empire and the establishment of the Raj as such. So there certainly is a reading among certain figures within the military, but I think more particularly among sort of broader commentators in Britain, and to some extent in India itself, that Islam, let's say, and Muslims are the problem. But I don't think that's a reading that is particular to the army, and I don't think it's a reading. My own understanding is that I don't think that is a reading that was or could have been tenable to army officers, army officials, or even kind of the most senior level of the Raj administration, for the very simple reason that so many tens and over time hundreds of thousands of Muslims served in the Indian army, as of course did, kind of, it must be added, hundreds of thousands of Hindus, and I don't have an exact figure, but of course very large numbers of Sikhs as well. The Indian colonial army was multi-religious. If he was only born, there were particular recruitment errors, but it was multi-religious. So suppressing Islam as such, or seeing Islam as a problem, is simply just not going to work for the Indian army, the colonial army. Nonetheless, of course, as I already sort of mentioned, and this is part of the tension of Barrack's Islam that I was interested in exploring, that doesn't necessarily mean that, of course, Islam is all sorts of things. So at the same point, there were various British officials, many British officials, who are trying to suppress this Wahhabi conspiracy, as it was termed. But of course, one has to bear in mind that in the late 19th century, pretty much the same time, a decade or two later after the Wahhabi trials in India, in Afghanistan, the Amir Abdur Rahman, the ruler of Afghanistan, and the religious elites of Afghanistan are putting out a whole series of texts, some of the very first texts ever published in Afghanistan, critiquing Wahhabis and trying to prevent the spread of Wahhabi Islam into Afghanistan as well. So the point is that, I don't think it gets us anywhere by talking, there's this one thing, Islam, and you're either for it or against it, whether you're a colonizer or whether you're the colonized, whether you're the Amir, the ruler of Afghanistan, or whoever else you are. Indian Muslims, Afghan Muslims, and I think, kind of at least British administrators and British army officers on the ground in India, if not people commenting from back in the UK, people on the ground, Muslim or not, who interacted with Indian society and with Muslims knew there were various different versions of Islam. Some of which were very much directed against the British and against colonization, some which were tried to withdraw from colonial society and live a life of separatism from colonial life that would enable Muslims to maintain their religious, their legal, their ethical, their intellectual, theological purity aside from colonial life, which of course is the Deoband movement, is the largest part of that. And the Deoband movement, of course, is apolitical in this period. It doesn't want to rebel against the British, and it doesn't want to, kind of, as it were, rebel against the Indian secular state thereafter through to the present day. And indeed, there are various figures in 1857, including, of course, various soldiers who do rebel against the army itself and against the state, and some of them seek exile and find exile, and in Mecca and Medina as well as elsewhere. And of course, others are executed or imprisoned, etc., etc. But my point is that it doesn't get us anywhere by thinking there's this one Islam, and people are at least kind of I think sort of influential people within the army. So with that in mind, though, as I say, there are figures both within military life, the British officer class, as well as in Indian society more general, Indian Muslim society, who are trying to reform religiosity. And this is, I suppose, where for me the element that this complex process gets more complex is the role of literacy. Because Urdu, or what was called back in the day military Hindustani, or simply just Hindustani, through the British Raj and indeed through the Colonial Indian Army, Urdu, Hindustani is much more promoted as a pan-Indian lingua franca, which is one of the other reasons why I'm always promoting the importance of Urdu, such a neglected language by historians. But virtually any topic you want to look at of colonial Indian life, you will find source materials in Urdu, whether written by Muslims or Sikhs, for whom, because of British colonial policy, Urdu becomes the language of instruction in the Punjab. So we have huge numbers of Sikh texts written by Sikhs in Urdu, as well as, of course, very large numbers of texts written by Hindus, of very different branches of the Hindu religions written in Urdu. So Urdu, but it's also the colonial state and the colonial army that is promoting not only Urdu, but literacy in Urdu across India, and not least through soldiers who are speaking Urdu, no matter where they're on service, who are spoken Hindustani through their interactions with locals in the markets of the Deccan, where people might be speaking Marathi or Telugu, or further south, kind of in Tamil regions or elsewhere. So, and also, of course, the Indian Army, because it's at the level of, to get promotion through the ranks of the Indian officer class, one needs literacy in Urdu. So the actual institutions of the army are promoting literacy if you want to rise up and be promoted. And then there's the creation then of a military literature in Urdu, both by British officials, which on the one hand is drill manuals, for example, and regulations, which of course Indian officers are expected to be able to know themselves in order to fulfill their role as officers in command. But then there's also texts or a journal that's founded, as I mentioned, in 1909, the Haqq, founded by British Army officials, but many of the contributors are Indian as well as British, writing in Urdu. So creating a whole literature and the Haqq, no one's worked on it to my knowledge, but it has all kinds of stories and short stories and kind of jokes, as well as what one might think of as military issues as well. It's a newspaper, it's a journal for soldiers who are not just Muslims, for all of the soldiers are reading Urdu. So there's this promotion of literacy, which of course also then creates a body of autobiographies in Urdu by various soldiers as well, which provide, of course, an important kind of source material, as well as these hagiographies I've looked at. So there's the spread of literacy by the army, through the army. But on the other hand, of course, it's the spread of literacy in the 19th century that at least a body of secondary scholarship that I've been sort of contributed to varying degree. And but there's this body of scholarship that has argued that the spread of printing, and I'm thinking particularly of the work of Francis Robinson, very influential, the notion of Protestant Islam, that it's actually with the spread of printing, the spread of literacy, and the translation of the Quran into Urdu in the 19th century, because some of the biggest publication ventures and translation ventures in the 19th century are translations of the Quran into Urdu. And this is creating then what different scholars are called a scripturalist Islam or a Protestant Islam that is much more based upon, let's say, Quran and Hadith, a reformist Islam in other ways, that has either little or no place for Sufis. And if it does have place for Sufis and Sheikhs, it doesn't have a place for these Muharram festivals, these carnivals, maybe these miracles, certainly not for the Tawa'if, the dancing girls, dancing women at the shrines, for the music, for the bhang, for the use of cannabis, etc. It's a reformist Islam that's been promoted by various indigenous Indian religious actors. Deobandis, most famously Sayyid Ahmad Khan, through the use of Urdu and through the promotion of let's say, a more scripturalist or more legalist religiosity, and one that is ultimately more critical of these miracles and these sheikhs and these pir padris, these kind of compound barracks Islam holy men, is ultimately more critical than actually of the Indian army itself. So in other words, then, the colonial army is spreading literacy, but nonetheless trying to uphold the religiosity and indeed patronize the religiosity of its soldiers. It's important, I suppose I should note here, that on the pay books of the colonial army are a whole series of what are classified in the English materials as native chaplains, which is to say Muslim chaplains, these pir padris, these qazis, of whom Afzal Shah Biyabani, one of the figures I talked about, was one of those. So these native chaplains might be Muslims, there might be Sikhs, which would be to say there will be Sikh grantees, as it were, Sikh priests or Sikh religious figures, or indeed Hindu pandits. And these figures were actually on the payroll of the register. They were part of the colonial army, just in the same way as the colonial army paid for chaplains who were Catholic. Even before a single Catholic was allowed in the British Army, there would have been Catholic chaplains in India, as well as Catholic soldiers. So in that way, kind of the Indian army is promoting, it's actually paying for the religiosity of the soldiers, but also paying salaries of actually religious specialists, Muslim sheikhs, Sikh grantees, Hindu pandits, in and of itself. So it's not suppressing religiosity. It would have been counterproductive. It couldn't have recruited Indian soldiers if it was doing that. As 1857, whatever one makes of those rumors or those facts about the bullets and the cartridges, as that episode demonstrated to everyone concerned. And yet, ironically, through the promotion of literacy through the mechanisms of the army, that sort of allowed, at least I argue in the book, an inroad for more reformist Islam coming from Indian Muslim reformists, as well as the critiques of Christian evangelicals who were not necessarily trying to convert Indian Muslims in the army, but nonetheless were trying to say, well, if you're going to be Muslim, be a proper Muslim. That's to say, follow your scripture and learn how to read it, rather than perhaps follow the superstitions, the khurafat, as one would say in Urdu, the language of the Muslim reformists. So, this classifying of Barracks Islam as a religion of superstition, of khurafat, rather than as actually, as it were, as a true, viable, acceptable version of Islam.
Right. That in itself sounds also complex, but the slashing and stashing that you've done through your book and also the explanation here sounds pretty curious and interesting to see how the entire picture was eventually being painted altogether, if I were to put this into simpler terms altogether. Which also gets me to another very major point also in this interview and also in your book. There are two major characters that you also talked about, which are also central to your book, the characters of Afzal Shah and Banne Mian. So can you just talk a little bit about their, first-hand accounts, which might have helped in creating a intersectional vision or the approach that you have also taken in your book and the entire subaltern study altogether?
Yeah, super. So thank you, Ritika. Yeah, I'm really keen to speak about these two really fascinating figures who, captured my imagination, as they evidently captured the imagination and the devotion of so many Indian subaltern soldiers a century and a half ago. So yes, Afzal Shah Bir Bani, he was born into a family of, when I say this, I'm sort of drawing, I should suppose say to an audience of historians, I'm drawing on here on his Urdu autobiography, his autobiography or hagiography that was published in 1913 and written by a local figure called Muhyiddin, who was actually a barrister and more of a reformist figure, which is sort of an interesting point in its own right, that the life of this miraculous figure, when it comes to be written in the 1910s, is actually already inflected itself by this reformist Islam that is coming through literacy and the rise of, as I say, Islamic reform in the 19th century. But certainly we know, we're told through that text that Afzal Shah, he's born in 1795 in, as I said, this little small village called Kazipet, around where there's the shrine, will be his shrine when he dies in 1856, but also the shrine of his ancestors. And like many of these Indian Muslim religious families, it was a father-to-son profession over the generations. And Afzal Shah then had learned literacy, learned Arabic and Persian, which of course Persian remained the administrative language of Hyderabad state until 1885. And presumably spoke Urdu and I dare say Telugu as well, in his daily life. But as the Hyderabad contingent then, which is the name of this military, this army that's set up within Hyderabad state, in the Nizam state, the Hyderabad contingent is founded in 1798 then, which is to say, during the childhood of Afzal Shah. And it has as its headquarters the Bolaram cantonment, which is just outside Hyderabad, and that's founded in 1800. And just near there's the cantonment district of Secunderabad, which is still, one of the key residents of the city of Hyderabad to this day. And this is sort of in the, not that far away, from Kazipet. And over time then, as during the as it were, as the Hyderabad contingent itself is founded, and as Afzal Shah grows up and becomes an alim, a sort of a religious figure, a qazi, a local judge, so to speak, in his local community, and has his name spreads to Hyderabad, and his name also spreads, his name and fame spreads to Bolaram, to the barracks. And there he starts to gain various followers. And again, I won't sort of recap what I've described earlier, but those kind of miraculous services, the miracles that Afzal Shah is supplying to his followers, both on the battlefield and also, very interestingly, during this rebellion at the Bolaram barracks in 1855, so just before 1857, when the Muharram celebrations then that I've said are so important to the soldiers are cancelled by an evangelical Christian officer, Brigadier Colin Mackenzie. And this creates then a rebellion, an uprising by the soldiers then, in which I have, as I say, these kind of two accounts, the British perspective, the British officers' perspective, and this perspective that's recorded then in Afzal al-Karamat, the Urdu hagiography of Afzal Shah, in which Afzal Shah himself appears and protects the soldiers in the midst of the putting down of the rebellion. And there are all of these other services that he supplies as a qazi, particularly, as I mentioned, these more literate services to do with the kind of the more literate side, because most soldiers, of course, are not literate at this point. And then one of his followers, who is a soldier, one of his soldier followers is someone called Muhammad Azam Khan. And he's actually from a family that, again, father to son, have been soldiers in the British Army, and presumably in armies before that, for generation to generation. We're told in his Urdu hagiography, published in 1921. And this figure, Muhammad Azam Khan, joins the Hyderabad contingent, but he's from, it's his father who joins the Hyderabad contingent, migrating from Punjab. So Muhammad Azam Khan, like so many of these soldiers, and reflecting what I've talked about the circulation of soldiers across South Asia, is a Punjabi Muslim, as were so many of the soldiers, along with Punjabi Sikhs and Hindus from Bengal, major parts of the recruits of the Colonial Army, and indeed of the Hyderabad contingent. Now, at some point during his service then, and this is one of the things that really interests me about the poignancy, I think, of subaltern life, Muhammad Azam Khan goes through perhaps what we nowadays call what we call post-traumatic disorder, something like that. And indeed, in the 19th century, such was, of course, at any point in history, the mental, the emotional, the spiritual, the moral shocks and conflicts of violence, of military violence, is such that British soldiers, as well as Indian soldiers, suffer trauma, as we would say nowadays, psychological trauma, as we would say it nowadays. Now, and of course, it's in the 19th century that psychology is taking shape in a pre-Freudian way, but it's taking shape in British medical circles. And in India, then, a whole series of asylums, as they're called, are founded for British officers. The most famous being the Deolali Sanatorium in what's now Maharashtra in the Bombay contingency, which gives us the British phrase in English still to this day. I don't know if it's still used in Indian English, to go doolally, to go crazy. And this were the asylums for British soldiers. But there are also a whole series of, established by the 1858 Asylums Act in India, a whole series of what we call natives-only asylums, which is asylums, mental hospitals. 25 of them were founded all over India, and a number of them were founded for Indian soldiers as well. And Muhammad Azam Khan, and this is where I was trying to draw between the hagiography and the hagiographical account and the records of the particular asylum, or the Pagalkhana, as it was plainly called in Urdu, the madhouse, literally, where he was interned. And it's at this point then where we start to have this really fascinating divergence then between the colonial, medical, materialist accounts that Muhammad Azam Khan has suffered what we would now call trauma, or what was called at the time either what would be called insanity in English, and what's understood in the Urdu accounts, and indeed by what would have been no doubt the oral accounts that are recorded from the mouths of his followers in his hagiography, that he goes through not so much a psychological trauma as a spiritual elevation of jazb. And jazb, that Urdu word from the Arabic, attraction towards God. And he becomes what's called in Urdu then, from the Arabic, a majzub, someone who is attracted to God, a holy fool, as one might say in English. One of these figures that are very much part of the religious landscape of South Asia for centuries, and indeed of other regions as well. So it's because in the, let's say, in Indian Muslim religious terms, and indeed of wider Indian religious terms, he's a faqir, plain and simple. He's a majzub. He's wandering around naked. This is attested by a fascinating photograph, a devotional photograph from the later years of his life. So quite an early Indian photograph, an early photograph in Hyderabad state showing him absolutely naked. And also in the Urdu text itself, he's always described as berahne. He's always wandering around naked around the city. And of course, this is precisely the kind of thing for the Indian army officers. This is like, we don't want to form a soldier, one of ours. We want them to be in uniform, not wandering around naked. And indeed, in the hagiography, he wanders into the cantonment areas. He's wandering around the shops. And another of these naked majzoobs, the former soldier Tajuddin, in his hagiography, Nagpur, wanders into the colonial Memsahib's tennis court. So even more shocking. So both of these figures are put into the Pagalkhana, put into the colonial asylum. And it's the asylum records as one of the sources I read. But again, when we look through the subaltern sources, through the Urdu sources, in Muhammad Azam Khan's case, through the hagiography Azam al-Karamat, we get this very different picture then, that this isn't madness, this isn't bi-adab, this isn't bi-adabi, this isn't kind of bad behavior. This is the behavior of a majzub, someone who is so attracted and drawn to God that neither the rules of the British, neither the rules of the army, nor indeed the rules of Sharia don't apply to majzubs. He's so absorbed in God, he's got a free pass. So, and this then, Muhammad Azam Khan then, his, as it were, his given name and his military name, and so to speak, his family name, then he then becomes Banne Mia. He's then the dear bridegroom or the naughty boy. That's his devotional name that is given the name in his hagiography. And at this point then, if you and our listeners who have made it this far will bear with us, I'd like to read translations of a couple of anecdotes from Azam al-Karamat to let those texts speak for themselves, or at least speak through my English translation. And this anecdotal style then is very much a part of these hagiographies, both in Urdu and in earlier texts as well, that are really important because I teach a class at UCLA on hagiography and social history, Muslim hagiography and social history, because, these texts are so important, whether it's for subaltern history or whether for pre-colonial periods, because they have so many voices in them. They're polyvocal, as I say. And many people, many ordinary people, soldiers or otherwise, villagers, tribes people, who wouldn't enter the historical record, that weren't literate, that weren't written about in court chronicles or state documents, find not only their way, but also their voices are recorded in these texts. So they're really kind of major sources, not just for religious life, but for, as I say, subaltern or ordinary social history in general. So anecdote 6 from Afzal al-Karamat, published in 1921. This deals with the escape of Banne Mia from the colonial asylum, or from the Pagalkhana, as it's called here in the text. So one day, with the help of the bazaar master, a British official, the cantonment magistrate, another British official, the cantonment magistrate of Aurangabad, had Banne Mia taken to the asylum by bullock cart by some other soldiers of the regiment. They took Banamir to the house of the superintendent of the asylum and left him there. But after sunset, a number of people saw Banamir entering the shop of an opium dealer in the regimental cantonment bazaar back in Aurangabad. The police immediately informed the bazaar master what had happened. Then, in the morning, the bazaar master came and asked the soldiers why they hadn't followed their orders and deposited their priest, their Pir Padri, with the superintendent of the asylum. But sir, the soldiers replied, we did take him to the superintendent's house. So, in response, the bazaar master ordered them to again take Banamir by cart and deliver him again into the care of the superintendent of the asylum, and this time bring back a receipt. So the soldiers then saw Banamir in front of the cart. And so they carried him away back to the asylum, where they delivered him again to the superintendent's house in Jalna and handed him over, and this time took a written receipt. Yet, the next morning again, all the people saw Banamir back in the same bazaar and in the same opium shop. And so once again, they informed the bazaar master. The bazaar master, this British official, was amazed because he had the receipt of Banamir's arrival at the asylum. So he set off himself to see the truth of the matter. And then he saw Banamir there in the bazaar with his own eyes. And seeing him, he exclaimed, undoubtedly, you are a great Sufi padre. Beshak aap bahut bada Pir Padre hai. Then the bazaar master lifted his hat in respect to Salam Banamir, sometimes go to Banamir and pay his respects, make his adab. So that's the end of that anecdote. And what we see here, I think clearly, is the story that the colonial state might try to imprison Banamir in the asylum, but miraculously he can escape again, again, and again. And so much so that even the British official, the bazaar master, ends up at the end of the anecdote acknowledging the miraculous power, the status of Banamir. You are a great Sufi padre. And again, it's this terminology of what I call barracks Islam. It's a Pir Padri. It's a type of Muslim figure that wouldn't exist without the colonial army, because this is, of course, an Urdu version of the Anglo-Portuguese term padre for a Christian chaplain. I'll read another somewhat shorter anecdote, this time of Banamir promoting a former fellow soldier in the army. So here we go. Anecdote 15. Ghulam Hussain Khan was a private in the 1st Cavalry of the Hyderabad contingent stationed in the cantonment at Aurangabad. One day he was in the cavalry bazaar, the Sipahi bazaar in Aurangabad, and His Holiness Banamir passed in front of him and called out, "Hey officer, Ari Dafadar, hey officer, where are you going?" Ghulam Hussain turned and then respectfully, but in surprise, said to him, "I'm only a sepoy, I'm only Sipahi, I'm not an officer, I'm not a Dafadar." But His Holiness Banamir in turn replied, "No, Ab Dafadar hai, you are an officer." Later that day, Ghulam Hussain Khan, the soldier, rode on his new horse before Major Colonel Ross. Now, I'll just interrupt the text here to add that this is one of these names that comes up in Urdu, Major Ross Sahib, and this is cross-checking with the British and the official records, or the Hyderabad contingent records. I found out this was a figure called Colonel Harry Ross, who was indeed at the time the most senior British officer, based actually in Ahmednagar at the cantonment there in what was then the Bombay Presidency. So back to the Urdu text. So His Holiness Banamir replies, "No, you are an officer." Then later that day, Ghulam Hussain Khan rode on his new horse before Major Colonel Ross. And Major Ross saw Ghulam Hussain and said, "Who is that sepoy?" And the cavalry officer replied, "Oh, just another sepoy, sir." But Major Colonel Ross said, "That person has the qualifications to be an officer, so I'm going to appoint him as an officer." And so later that day, Ghulam Hussain Khan was promoted to the rank of officer, to the rank of Dafadar. Later, he went back before His Holiness Ban Amir to pay his respects by kissing his feet, by performing the Qadam Busi. So, to end the anecdote there, what we see here again is working within the confines of the structures of military life. It's Ban Amir, the pagal, the insane, or for his followers, the majzub, the God-intoxicated former soldier, who is able to promote a soldier through the official ranks of the army. And indeed, it's Ban Amir, then, the purpose of the story, who is influencing the mind of this Major Harry Ross, or Colonel Harry Ross, to actually promote then this soldier, to recognize him and actually promote him through the officer ranks, which of course then creates not only a rise in prestige, but also a rise in salary. And indeed, then he goes and the soldier then, or the officer now, goes and pays his respects back to Ban Amir, and perhaps makes a donation, makes a nazar, as is part of the adab, the etiquette of shrine visitation and gratitude for miracles.
Right. I mean, this actually proves in a way what might have interested you in these two central figures and putting them onto one of the other cores of the book. So yeah, I mean, that adds up. This also actually, in the entire course of the anecdotes that you presented, there's this parallel question that was looming in my head, although not directly associated, but sort of indirectly associated, let's say. I was looking at how these religious beliefs altogether and practices were being transformed by both indigenous actions and the sort of initiatives that were taken by the colonizers altogether, that might be or probably shaping the way we look at it at present, or maybe back then. So do you think all of this together might have also sort of fostered a pressurizing or a sort of a pressure, let's say, which might have had any effect on the socio-cultural position of these sepoys?
Yeah, well, that's a fascinating question, Ritika. Thank you. So, well, I think when I wrote this book, which is 15 years ago now, and in the conclusions I wrote then, and a few articles I wrote as a follow-up, I think I was very decisive and I think conclusive and adamant that yes, between, let's say, Protestant British notions of true religion that had influenced, of course, the whole literature on Hindu reform, on Sikh reform, as well as Islamic reformism in colonial South Asia, that these sort of models of true religion, whether you're Muslim, Hindu, or Christian, or Sikh or whatever, they did, on the one hand, shape, or let's say ring the death knell for this barracks Islam, as indeed did the Indian Muslim reformist groups as well. And it's certainly the case, I think I've been told, that a group like the Tablighi Jamaat, which comes out of the Deoband reform group, and I'm told that in Pakistan, at least in the post-colonial army, the Tablighi Jamaat has been very influential in promoting, let's say, reformist Islam among post-colonial Indian soldiers. So I think my sense was, when I finished the book, that yes, this is a form of religiosity that's gone through, or at least had already disappeared by the end of the colonial period, let's say by 1947. But in some ways, I wonder whether that is entirely the case now. I think certainly on the one hand, I mean, the army is interesting because whether in India or Pakistan or Bangladesh, I mean, the post-colonial armies institutionally, regimentally, in terms of regimental culture, military culture, preserve much of colonial culture in a way that hasn't happened in other elements of post-colonial Indian society. And no doubt elements of a barracks Islam have continued, I suspect, and one of the ways in which that, I think, at least looking across the Indian 1947 border into Pakistan, is that the shrine of Zindapir outside Rawalpindi, as a Sufi, another miracle worker who was actually had many followers in the Pakistani army who became promoters of his shrine and his cult and patrons, etc. So I think perhaps my definitive view that I ended the book fits much more neatly historiographically, let's say, with the literature of, what happens with colonization, what happens with Islamic reform. But I suspect probably other researchers who I hope will be perhaps encouraged if they've managed to listen this far in our conversation. I hope other researchers might be able to uncover a less definitive end to this forms of religiosity, and how Barracks Islam and indeed Barracks Hinduism or Barracks Sikhism have continued after the 1930, when I cut off my book, and indeed after 1947 have continued in a transformative way, which my story is about. It's about transformations, but I suspect that even a miraculous dimension of religiosity is still to this day. Certainly, we have a really hugely outside of colonial South Asia, but we have a really important, for some people no doubt troubling, hagiography or martyrology that was actually written in Afghanistan in Arabic, but translated into many different languages, many different languages after it was written in the late mid-1980s by the Palestinian Mujahid fighting against the Soviets in Afghanistan, Abdullah Azam. And that's a text called Ayat al-Rahman fi Jihad al-Afghan, the signs of the merciful God in the Afghan Jihad. And that's a story of a whole series of battlefield miracles granted to Muslim soldiers fighting, in this case, against what we might think of another colonial army, that of the Soviet empire, so to speak, which of course is very much an anti-religious empire. So Abdullah Azam was an Islamist, he was a Mujahid, politically troubling, no doubt, for many people. But nonetheless, my point being that right through to the 1980s, and indeed it's a book that's been translated, is widely available in many languages, including online to this day, miracles still very much happen on the battlefield. And I've no doubt that that is a part of the demands, the existential, spiritual, psychological demands of fighting in any sphere and in any religion, Christian, Muslim, Hindu, or otherwise, which is why military chaplains are still much a part of American or British military life, as indeed of other cultures of the world. So I think there probably has been various types of reform, no doubt, but I think such are the existential demands of what soldiers have to do for a living that I think religiosity will always stay within military life, even if it gets, as it were, if it disappears from many other more comfortable spheres of human experience, whether in South Asia or elsewhere.
Right, I totally agree to that. Also, I'm afraid that we have reached the near end of this interview, so I'll just have one concluding question to you, Dr. Green. So what other projects are you currently working on, which we might keep an eye on, because this entire intriguing conversation has been a great handoff to other projects that we can look up to. So would you want to say something about them, just share something with our audience?
Yeah, sure. Well, I recently published a book in that series, Oxford Very Short Introductions, which I know is certainly available in India and across South Asia. And that's a very short introduction to global Islam. And here, I try to create in this short book, very short book, I tried to create an analytical distinction between what I would call world Islam, all those forms of local religiosity across the Islamic world, of which Barracks Islam was one of many regional examples, and a distinction between Barracks Islam and global Islam, which I define as the forms of Islam which have emerged and spread during the time period and through the mechanisms of modern globalization, which I would define as being from 1870, the coming of global railroad, steamship, telegraph, communication networks, and 2020, when I ended my book, and with the with, I guess, the end of the more recent phase of neoliberal globalization. So it's a sort of a survey, an attempt to understand also actually the very large role of South Asia. One of the things I try to understand in that book is how it is that South Asian Muslim organizations have had perhaps an outside, or certainly a very prominent role in global Islam, perhaps more than perhaps many people, perhaps at least more than people who think that Islam is all about the Middle East, might be surprised. And I try to understand some of the roles in that, which certainly have their origins in colonial history and in the various elements of that. So that's my most recent book, Global Islam: A Very Short Introduction.
Right. That is something that we will really look forward to, and especially the young audience would absolutely be listening to this entire conversation. And thank you so much, Dr. Green, for coming to India Colonized and having this amazing and intriguing conversation. I might have a couple of homework questions to do when I go back from here. So yes, thank you so much. Thank you so much for being on board with us.
Well, thank you so much, Ritika, and to the whole team for inviting me. It's been really wonderful to revisit these fascinating stories, and at least to me, fascinating and fascinating source materials. And I hope in some way to encourage other scholars to dig into this, kind of incredibly rich archive or indeed published set of Urdu materials on whatever subject historians of colonial India are working on. Thank you all for listening.
Thank you for tuning into this conversation. We really hope you enjoyed this, and if you did, please consider subscribing to our channel and podcast for more such amazing content. We have a series of amazingly curated interactions with authors and scholars on the issues of contemporary relevance. Do check out our website, www.ergostudios.com, for more blogs and podcasts exploring the tales of contemporary relevance. Do follow us on our social media sites for more exciting updates. Until next time, stay safe and stay curious.